Barker's, the jam maker, it wants to discharge 12,000 cubic metres of industrial wastewater into a dock reserve, and that decision is going to be made by dock by March the 5th. 12,000 cubic metres is equivalent to 5 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And Barker's wants to spray that wastewater onto the land.
Yeah, if you think like an agricultural irrigator, that's the kind of thing that you do. You have a thing that turns around and then it sprays a certain amount of land with that wastewater, like you would see driving down a lot of highways in a lot of parts of New Zealand.
That is the solution offered by a factory owned by a multi-billion-dollar food giant. We're talking about wastewater with fruit pulp, jam and cleaning agents sitting in smelly ponds that will be sprayed onto conservation reserve.
It's like an amazing picture that is portraying a New Zealand company in a natural environment, and it's beautiful. But as a company, they have to produce industrial wastewater. And that's been the main problem for the past years.
I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Today on The Detail, the famous jam maker that started life in a farm shed nearly 60 years ago and is now in a pickle over its waste.
Nestled at the base of the Southern Alps in beautiful South Canterbury, New Zealand. And we've been crafting delicious fruit preserves, chutneys and syrups for over 42 years, founded by the Barker family.
That's a promo for Barker's in 2014 before the French family firm Andros took a majority stake. Newsroom's David Williams picks up the saga.
It's a lovely New Zealand story. It's everybody wants something to be started in a cowshed, don't they? And to be innovative and to try something on the side. I think it was elderberry wine, which was the first thing that was produced there. And so it's been this iconic story associated with this iconic brand, the Barker's family. And then if you track forward, it became very successful and you could see it through our supermarket shelves. And then the French company, or Andros Group, the French company, it brought into Barker's, I think in 2015, and then last 2 years ago now, it took over entirely. And so, yes, there's been a bit of a shift in recent years, and people around the factory haven't been entirely happy with the way that Barker's is behaving.
Why? What's changed about the operation?
I think there's several things. If you look at why a foreign company might come in and buy a company, they obviously had plans. There's a $60 million expansion going on in this factory. And the factory is just out of Geraldine. It's in a place called Pleasant Valley. You know, it's quite a big operation. I've stood outside it myself. I mean, $60 million is a lot of coin, and they're expanding a lot. So this is what the Overseas Investment Office signed off on. They said, well, this is a good investment because it's good for the economy and that they're spending money on the business, and that it'll also include jobs. Something like 10% of Geraldine's population is employed by this one company. So it's got kind of an outsized effect on the town. And any big industrial company has certain things it has to deal with, and wastewater has been a bit of an ongoing problem. There have been abatement notices. They have breached their consents. They tried to change their conditions. But this saga has really picked up pace in that there was an abatement notice issued in April last year, and then a Barker's employee was spotted opening a hydrant, and so the wastewater from those ponds were just pouring out onto land adjacent, very near the river and this reserve. And that led to a couple of infringement notices, interestingly pinned on the staff member, not the company itself. The company said it took serious internal actions following that. But it doesn't appear to be that they've come up with a solid plan to deal with this wastewater. They bought the neighbouring property for $1.4 million, and they said, we're going to discharge into the forest on that land, and that will help us deal with that. But then in the interim, they've gone back to the Conservation Department and said, look, can we just discharge the rest of the wastewater from these ponds onto that reserve? Previously, they did discharge to this piece of land, the dock reserve, but it was actually burning off the grass. So there's a big question mark hanging over the effect on that reserve, but also neighbours are certainly nervous about the effect of the discharges in this forest as well.
Just so I'm clear on this, Has it always had those wastewater ponds, the 2 ponds next to the factory?
Certainly the consent extends back a number of years. So if they haven't always been there, they've certainly been there for quite a long period.
And up until about 2017, I believe, there wasn't an issue at all?
Well, not that authorities knew of. I mean, this is the issue that you have when you sit above everything. You're looking at a company acting in its own interests. You're also looking at a regulator, not only how they regulate when they've been told about something, but how they're able to monitor and regulate companies that when they've got that many consents. I mean, there is a question mark to say if people are self-monitoring, if they're just declaring every year what goes on, how effective is that, and is it in the company's interest to tell the regulator everything? And even when the regulator does find wrongdoing, you look at how it acts and what change it has. And so I guess the ending of this story will be how effective that wastewater treatment is and where the wastewater goes, and whether there will be a continuation of either problems with the wastewater discharges or the odour problem that's really become an issue in recent months, presumably before as well.
It's DOC and ECAN, which is the Canterbury Environmental, the regulator. It's been clashing with both these agencies.
That's right. I'm not sure exactly what the nature of that agreement was to discharge to the conservation reserve initially. I don't know whether that was a formal licence or a shaking of the hand. Yes, that can happen, but certainly it was formalised at some point, and there was a licence granted and that discontinued because of the problems with the soil that were identified. And ECAN became aware, and it actually took action, put these abatement notices in saying that the chemicals that you have in your wastewater are causing issues in the soil on parcels of land other than your own, and that actually breaches your consent, so please don't do that. And then when the wastewater discharge happened, the opening of this hydrant by the Barker's employee, that's why there were 2 infringement notices, because one was a breach of the abatement notice, which said you can't discharge close to a waterway or a water bore.
I'm actually surprised that DOC gave it permission in the first place. I mean, is this kind of commonplace if there's a factory near conservation land that they would go to DOC? I mean, are you aware of any other cases like this?
No, not in particular. It does seem jolting or jarring, doesn't it, that you would allow industrial waste to be discharged onto a piece of conservation reserve. Barker's would say that this is low-value conservation reserve, and that's why they've been allowed to do it, and that the how important that reserve is has been reclassified, and that's why there's been a problem. But it does seem unusual. But then again, if you think about the licensing that DOC does, I mean, DOC often allows cattle to be grazed on conservation land. So it's not unusual for a practice that you don't necessarily associate with conservation to happen on reserve land.
You can see those ponds there, lined with polythene. That's where the wastewater from the factory is stored.
That's Barker's former CEO, Michael Barker, showing RNZ's Country Life the ponds in 2023 before he sold out of the company.
The water in here is the water that's been used in the factory. So when you're washing down equipment and washing down the floors, you pick up a bit of fruit, skins and waste, and so it's great stuff to irrigate to land because the microbes in the soil love it.
But that water also contains cleaning chemicals, and in fact, the soil doesn't love it. Sodium hydroxide in the wastewater has caused salt to build up in the soil. And already, by the time Michael Barker was saying that, there were issues, which have escalated in the last 2 years. Timaru Herald journalist Federico Magrin has reported that hundreds of emails have been exchanged between ECAN, DOC and Barker's over the past 18 months. He calls it a battle of cease and desist orders, claims and counterclaims. Federico's from Italy, so he comes at the story from a different angle.
It's a massive company. It's a massive New Zealand company. And if you think of their factory, which is next to Geraldine, it also portrays well New Zealand. Like in the backdrops, you have the Four Peaks Range conservation area. And that's where the high Te Moana River flows from. And then it flows next to the factory. It's like an amazing picture that is portraying a New Zealand company in a natural environment, and it's beautiful. But as a company, they have to produce industrial wastewater, and that's been the main problem for the past years.
How do the local people feel about it? They must be torn a bit because, as you say, it's the town's biggest employer. It kind of put Geraldine on the map, and yet there's clearly an environmental issue here.
I don't know. For me, as an Italian, it's quite strange to see such a big factory in a rural area. And if we compare it with other factories, the Andros factories, like their main factories in Biars-sur-Serre, which is like a extremely industrial area in southwestern France. And in France, they have like a depuration station with a methane set that is producing biogas, which is renewable energy. And then they discharge their wastewater into the river next to the factory because the wastewater is highly treated. And that's happening in industrial France. Whereas in New Zealand here, what we have is this company that is using the land as a treatment station, kind of. There is a very striking difference between how they treat wastewater in France and New Zealand, even though one is in an industrial area and one is like sitting next to a reserve with people living around the factory.
So you've seen how it's done in Europe, and I guess they've got really tight rules there. So when you started covering the story here about Barker's, were you surprised about what this company was getting away with?
Well, Europe is extremely different because, like in Italy, we have the same kind of land area as New Zealand, but we have 12 times more people living in it, and France is quite similar. So you have like a clustered area where people live very close to each other, and the industrial areas are packed with factories. So there are higher regulations. And when I started digging into this story and reading and researching, I found some regulatory documents in France that were telling what the company could do there. And it was extremely different from what Ecan was telling Barker's to do there. The French factory has a limit for the amount of organic pollution that it can discharge that ends up going into the water. And the one that Barker's is allowed to do is like 32 times more than the French counterpart.
Is that right? Wow.
It's striking. Yeah. I mean, it's not the end yet. This story is still going.
Let's recap here. The way Barker's is getting rid of its industrial wastewater is upsetting neighbours and causing tension with Environment Canterbury and DOC. The company says the long-term solution is to discharge the wastewater onto a block of nearby pine forest it recently bought. In the meantime, it wants to spray the waste from its smelly ponds onto DOC Reserve.
This reserve, I mean, we have a picture of it. Like, it's quite a pristine area. There's a river, and the neighbors are concerned again because this is happening, even though they were declined a concession to discharge wastewater just last year. It's just that it's not clear anymore what could be a solution to this problem. The ponds, the pine plantation, the preserve is not clear.
And so you've been in contact with some of the neighbours. Are they quite vocal about this?
They are, as I guess a person living next to a smelly pond would be probably. Most of the neighbours told me that either when they moved there or when the company started growing, they were aware of what was going to happen. They didn't know about the smell though, except the farmer who has the grazing rights on the DOC Reserve, who is affected in a different way. Most of the neighbours are concerned about the smell. There is a person who moved there, and in 3 years, they're going to retire, this family. And they're just concerned that the pine plantation is going to smell terribly, which is like the block next to theirs. And so they've been affected, yes, but there is a conflict, which is why we're writing new stories about it, I think, because we can see both perspectives.
Yeah.
A business who is growing and is trying to talk with the regulator and with DOC and the neighbours partially talking at times with media, and neighbours who have been affected by the smell or the spraying of wastewater. So I think it's quite an interesting story.
But it is interesting that it's dragged on for so long. Or is it that new issues have popped up along the way?
Well, they've had multiple issues, but the first time they were found in breach of consent was 2017 and 2018. And then I think it escalated in 2024, 2025, when DOC, for some reasons that I'm not sure we're all privy of, they found that they did not have any more concession to spray wastewater in the land. So it is ongoing issues. If we think 2017 is almost 9 years. And it's something that they need to find a long-term solution for. Some neighbours claim having a wastewater treatment plant on site would be the final solution, as just very expensive, and consulting agency that the Barkers employed found the price would be excessive. But if you think of the French multinational that owns Barkers, it's a very big company, so perhaps they could find the money, but I don't know.
Have you been able to talk to the company at all about this?
Last year they were more talkative, like they wanted to engage and they wanted to explain what was happening from their side, and they wanted to give me their side of the story. Then after the first stories started coming out, they were claiming that what was being portrayed in the media was misleading and there was misinformation. I believe they were trying to portray themselves as the party who was damaged. They were saying there was a conflict between opinion given too much importance versus science. Lately, they've not been engaging as much. The relationship that we had last year has deteriorated a bit because we kept finding new stories and what's going on with the company. And maybe they didn't want this all to be in the public sphere.
David Williams says neighbours are nervous about Barker's plans for the pine plantation, but they're also frustrated with the agencies.
One of the interesting aspects of this is how councils act, right? And so there was an application by Barkers to discharge onto this newly bought block of land, and the neighbours wanted some input into that. They said, we would like to make a submission, yet ECAN made their decision without the input or submission of those neighbours. I guess they were not deemed an affected party. And so people really do scratch their heads sometimes when you're right next to a piece of land where industrial wastewater is going to be discharged, yet you don't even have input into what happens there.
It's sort of this example of a conflict, because here is this formerly a family-owned business, real success story, now employs 300 people in this rural area. So, there's so many good things about it, and yet environmentally it's not doing the right thing.
It's definitely a conflict, isn't it? If you're talking about jarring or jolting, the idea that the environmental issues caused by an industrial company should be put onto a piece of conservation reserve, I just don't understand that. I'm scratching my head about that. And so, yes, if you are a prominent company in New Zealand and you're not doing right by the environment, then the public takes notice of that. But Barkers would argue, I guess, that they've spent $1.4 million on the neighbouring land. They have a plan, and their environmental consultants say that it will be okay. The question might be, well, didn't your environmental consultant say that the wastewater pond water would be okay and the chemical treatment that you put on it would be okay for soil? But that didn't turn out so well, did it?
And what are Barkers saying?
Well, it depends on the story. In some stories, they're quite strident. They will defend themselves very forcefully, particularly about the events of this particular wastewater hydrant that was turned on by one of their employees. They push back on the regulator saying, well, if there was a real issue, why didn't they phone us? Why didn't they tell us to turn the tap off? Why didn't they approach us? And so I asked for the notes from Environment Canterbury, ECAN, the regional council, and pretty much that's what their officers did. They went and checked out what was happening. They knocked on the door of the factory. They waited in their car until a manager arrived, and then they asked them what was going on, who did this, and can they turn off the tap, please? And, I mean, there was a pump involved. It was it wasn't an accident. It wasn't like this hydrant was left on by mistake. It was being pumped out from the wastewater pond. But Barker sometimes will stridently push back like that. For this latest story that I had about them wanting to discharge onto the conservation reserve, I couldn't get a comment from them. They didn't come back to me.
And what about ECAN and DOC? I mean, the way they have handled all of this?
Well, if we start with DOC raised an issue with Barker's. There was a problem with the soil, and then they tried to work with a company, and when it didn't really work out, they stopped. The licence was allowed to expire, and so I can't fault that. I don't know why they let them discharge onto a conservation reserve for the first place. That's a question for them. But when faced with an application from anyone, they have to consider it, and they have to make sure there's enough information for them to make a good decision. I guess the public may judge them by whatever they decide goes on here. And if they do decide to approve it and there's no environmental issue, then that's okay too. In terms of Environment Canterbury, well, they were called on a stormy night. They went out and checked it out, and they issued a couple of infringement notices. The question marks that some people might have is, well, you've gone for the employee here, you've issued an individual fines. Wasn't the company at fault here, and why were they not also sanctioned in some way? And the explanation from ECAN was that it was down to an employee, and pretty much, if I can remember correctly, they said that there wasn't sufficient evidence to prove that this was a problem for the whole company. What I hope through highlighting these stories is that the public does take an interest, and it seems to me that regulators and government agencies, when they have people looking over their shoulders, they might make better decisions.
So a final decision from DOC is due by March the 5th. If it decides that it's okay to discharge this 12,000 cubic metres of wastewater, is that what the neighbours want? Will they be happy with that decision?
I doubt it, but this is a conservation reserve, and so that's a matter for the Conservation Department. If they do get approval for this discharge, then you would think that the Conservation Department would be interested in any remediation of that land, whether it's low value or high value conservation land or not. It's held on behalf of the public of New Zealand for conservation purposes. This is about how regulators act when they have information and what they do in the face of, companies pushing back. This is one case, but you would argue that, is this a case of regulators up and down the country? But the public should be interested in these things. They're important. Companies that emit or have wastewater that they need to deal with need to do it properly.
Have ECAN been a bit spineless in this?
Certainly some people would argue yes. The idea that they would just receive an application for the discharge next door in this land that Barker's bought without input from the public was a bit of a kind of a bang on the nose for some of the neighbours. They really wanted to have some input, and I think that would have gone a long way for them to at least have felt that they were heard. And there were similar issues with the consent from the Timaru District Council in terms of the building or expanding the factory. People felt like there should have been more input. So I don't know why. It would be up to those councils to explain why that is. But often people who have objections, they just want to be sure that somebody's heard them properly and considered what they have to say.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. Gwen McClure produced this episode and Mark Chesterman engineered it. Thanks to David Williams and Federico Magrin. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Ka kite.